Wish, chapters 10 through 14. Chapter 10. When I got home, I told Gus and Bertha about Howard's plan to catch Wishbone. "We're going to build a great big trap," I said, stretching my arms out to show how big, "with chicken wire from his daddy's workshop." Gus's eyebrows shot up. "A trap, huh?" I nodded. "Well, kind of. More like one of those big dog crates. We're going to put it at the edge of the woods beside the garden shed, and then we're going to stick branches and leaves and stuff in like chicken wire so it blends in." I went on to explain how we were going to put something good to eat inside the crate, and when Wishbone went in to eat it, we'd close the door. "He likes meatloaf," Bertha said, "and hot dogs, and bologna." She tossed a couple of pieces of fish stick left over from supper onto the floor for the two cats. "Now, I don't want to rain on your parade, Charlie, but what if the dog isn't friendly to people? What if he bites? What if he has some kind of dog disease?" "He won't bite. He likes me," I said, ignoring the question about dog disease. "Gus," Bertha said, "tell Charlie about the dog you had when you were a kid." And then she went and told me about Gus's dog named Skeeter, who used to catch rabbits and bring them home for Gus and his sisters to play with. And one time he climbed in the back of the produce truck and ended up all the way down in Hendersonville and showed up on the front porch the next day full of porcupine quills. Right, Gus? Gus nodded. Right. "And then one time he dug up a hornet's nest," Bertha said. "The dog must have had 9 lives, like a cat." "Must have," Gus said. "Tell her about how he waited for you outside school every day." Bertha scooped one of the cats onto her lap. "Oh, and tell her about how he used to steal chicken livers right out of the frying pan." "We're gonna bore this poor child to death, Bertie," he said, winking at me. "Right, Butterbean?" Gus had started calling me Butterbean sometime. That made me feel like a baby, but I didn't say anything. Then Bertha told us about some woman in the grocery store who fainted in the cereal aisle, but I wasn't really listening because I was thinking about Wishbone. I pictured him waiting at school for me every day. Then he'd run alongside the school bus like he'd done that day I saw him fighting. Maybe the bus driver would let him on the bus because he was so smart and would do tricks for all the kids. He'd sleep in my bed every night and I'd sing good old Noah to him. He'd let me play Jackie's Raleigh High School t-shirt on him and maybe even paint his toenails red. I'd teach him to go up to the end of the driveway on Sunday mornings and get the newspapers before church. He'd chase rabbits out of the garden and sit on the porch with us every night. I still had a little niggle about Mama having a hissy fit when I brought him back to Raleigh with me, but I pushed that aside. By the time Bertha went inside to get a box of graham crackers for us, I was so in love with Wishbone I could hardly stand it. I sure hoped Howard's plan worked. "Let's go set up the sprinkler in the garden," Gus said to me, tugging on his dirty baseball cap. I followed him outside with 3 cats sauntering along beside us. I helped him untangle the hose and drag it out to the garden. While he attached the sprinkler to it, I walked up and down the tidy rows of pole beans and squash and tomato plants growing bigger every day. The soft dirt was warm under my bare feet. Suddenly, a ladybug landed on my arm. I put my finger next to it and let it climb on. Then I held my finger up and whispered, "Ladybug, ladybug, fly away home." As I watched that little ladybug fly off into the sky, I made my wish. Jackie called again that night. She told me she had put those blue streaks in her hair, and now everybody at school was copying her. "I swear, Charlie," she said, "everybody in Raleigh's got blue streaks in their hair." Then she told me how she met some boy who played guitar in a band and had his nose pierced. His name was Cockroach, and her sort of kind of boyfriend, Arlo, didn't like him. "Cockroach?" I said, because what else can you say to that? But she just kept on talking. She couldn't wait to graduate and kiss that school goodbye. She and some girl named Shayla might move to Fort Lauderdale if Shayla's uncle could get them jobs in his Mexican restaurant. But if that didn't happen, she might go to school to be a dental assistant. She sure had lots of plans, but it seemed like none of them included me. "Are you going to come visit me sometime?" I asked in a tiny voice that sounded like a baby. "Of course I am, Charlie," she said, "as soon as I get time." I guess she had lots of times for Cockroach, but no time for me. Out on the porch that night, Bertha told Gus about her day while I sent my thoughts zipping through the trees to wherever Wishbone was. I wanted him to know he didn't have to be a stray like me. I wanted him to be mine. Then my mind wandered to the Odoms. I wondered what they were doing right now that very minute. I bet they were all piled on pillows on the floor eating popcorn and playing Crazy Eights. I bet Mrs. Odom was taping their school papers up on the wall and telling them how proud she was of them. Then she'd have to say rutabaga so Cotton would stop drawing on all the walls with markers. Gus interrupted my thoughts when he stood up and stretched and said, Time to turn in. I hated the thought of another school day. That awful bus with gum on the seats and kids snickering when I walked by. Mrs. Willoughby frowning at me and tossing my marked up papers onto my desk with a sigh. The cafeteria with kids flinging peas at each other and ignoring me. There were only a few more weeks of school left, but it felt like 100 years to me. There was no doubt about it. I needed Wishbone more than ever. Chapter 11. The next day at school, it seemed like the clock had stopped, and the day was stuck in a never-ending torture of math and social studies and gym. Even lunch and recess were in slow motion. Finally, the dismissal bell rang, and I hightailed it to the bus. I plopped down in my usual spot and waited for Howard. He must have been taking his own sweet time because the seats were starting to fill up. The next thing I knew, Audrey Mitchell was making her way up the aisle, cutting her eyes from side to side searching for a seat. I couldn't believe it when she sat next to me, propping her backpack between us so she wouldn't catch any of my cooties. "You can't sit here," I said. She made an ugly face at me and said, "Yes, I can." "No, you can't," I sort of hollered. She flinched a little and gaped at me. "You can't save seats," she said. "That's the rule." Pineapple, pineapple, pineapple. But Howard's dumb trick didn't work because the next thing I knew, I had shoved her right off the seat and into the aisle. The minute I did it, I regretted it. Everybody liked Audrey. I ought to be bringing her candy bars and telling her how nice her hair looked instead of shoving her onto the dirty bus floor. Luckily, Audrey didn't have a temper like me, and scrappy. All she did was yelp a little bit, dust herself off, call me crazy, and move to another seat. By the time Howard finally got there, my temper had settled down from a boil to a simmer. He dropped into the seat next to me. "What fired you up?" he asked. I looked out the window so he couldn't see my still red face. "I'm not fired up," I said. He pushed his glasses up on his nose and went, "Huh?" Then he dug around in his backpack and pulled out half a cheese sandwich. He took the cheese out, rolled it into a ball, and popped it into his mouth. Then he did the same with the bread, rolling it into doughy balls. As the bus made its way through the streets of Colby, I thought about the trap we were going to make to catch Wishbone, and my simmering anger disappeared. In its place was a swirl of excitement. When we got to Howard's, Mrs. Odom was on the porch with Cotton, smiling and waving to the bus driver. Howard, Dwight, and me sat on the porch steps while she asked about our day. Did Mrs. Willoughby finally get the window fan fixed? Was Dwight's math test hard? Did the PTA sell cupcakes in the cafeteria again? Then Howard whipped some papers out of his backpack and thrust them at her, grinning. "Ta-da!" he said. "She made such a fuss over those papers, you'd have thought they were made of pure gold." I could practically feel my marked-up papers jammed into the bottom of my backpack, weighing heavily on my lap. I wished I had a good one so I could say ta-da, too. Howard didn't really need to be my backpack buddy anymore since I knew my way around school, and I definitely knew the rules. Instead, he kept offering to help me with some of my schoolwork. I always said no, because what was the use? I wasn't even going to be at that school much longer, I reminded him. His face would droop and he'd say, "You never know, you might be." I ignored that and stuffed my sorry-looking papers in my backpack like I didn't even care one bit. But sitting on that porch with Mrs. Odom, I sort of wished I had let him help me. After we had banana pudding for a snack, me and Howard went straight back to the ramshackle garage behind his house. I swear that garage looked like it was going to fall right over, tilting sideways with the door hanging off one hinge. We stepped inside, and Howard's daddy looked up from his workbench in the corner. When he stood up, I thought his head was going to go right through the ceiling. He was so tall. He had great big freckled hands and fiery red hair and twinkly blue eyes. He smelled like grass and sawdust and gasoline all mixed together. "Hey there," he said, and his big booming voice bounced around the little garage, practically shaking the saws and shovels right off the walls. I'd seen him at church mopping his sweaty face with a handkerchief while he belted out, "When the roll is called up yonder," but I'd never talked to him. While most folks were drinking coffee and chit-chatting in the fellowship hall, Mr. Odom and some of the other men were outside inspecting each other's truck engines or watching teenagers play basketball in the parking lot. "Well, look at you," he said to me. "You know, you are the spitting image of your mama." My mama? I hadn't expected that. "I am?" I asked. "You sure are. Look just like her." "You mean Bertha?" I said. "Nah, Carla," he said. "Your mama." "You know her?" "Don't really know her," he said. "Only seen her a time or two." "In Raleigh, you mean?" "Nah, up yonder at Gus and Bertha's." He brushed sawdust off the front of his shirt. "Seems like just yesterday, but I reckon it wasn't," he said. "Oh," was all I could think to say, but my mind was racing. When had Mama been at Gus and Bertha's? How come nobody ever told me? Old Howie here has been talking about you non-stop, he said, winking at Howard. I felt my cheeks burn. Then Mr. Odom said, so, y'all gonna catch that mangy old hound, are you? Yes, sir. That mutt's a rascal, I can tell you that. Been chased away from every chicken coop and garbage can in Colby. His name is Wishbone, Howard said. Mr. Odom chuckled. Well, that's a fine name. He likes me, I said. Charlie's gonna keep him, Howard said, but we have to catch him first. So Mr. Odom showed us how to staple chicken wire to wood and how to screw on hinges for a door, and before long, we had a trap perfect for catching a dog. When Burl got home from his job pumping gas, he helped us load the trap into the back of his truck and drove us to Gus and Bertha's. My thoughts kept flitting around all over the place, sometimes thinking about Wishbone and sometimes thinking about Mama being up there at Gus and Bertha's. But Burl played the radio so loud none of my flitting thoughts had a chance to settle down in one place. When we got to Gus and Bertha's, we set the trap up over by the bushes at the edge of the yard, while me and Howard gathered leaves and branches to stick through the chicken wire. Bertha kept Burl busy with all her questions. Did he think his mama would like some pickled okra from the garden when it was ready? Was Lenny still in the marching band? Had his grandmama had the hip surgery yet? Burl said, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, ma'am. Finally, me and Howard finished, and I swear you could hardly see that trap nestled there in the bushes. I ran inside the house and got the pie tin of table scraps I'd been saving, a piece of bacon, a biscuit, some tuna noodle casserole. I pushed the pie tin way back up into the corner of the trap and said, okay, now all we have to do is wait. Chapter 12. Me and Howard waited and waited, but Wishbone never showed up. Gus had come outside a couple of times and sat with us, chewing on a toothpick and stroking the scrawny black cat curled up in his lap. Every now and then, Bertha would stick her head out the front door and call out, catch him yet? We'd put our fingers to our lips and shush her, and she'd slap her hand over her mouth and go, oops, sorry. When the sun began to disappear behind the mountains and the lightning bugs twinkled out in the garden, Gus stood up in that slow way of his and said, want me to drive you home, Howard? No, sir, Howard said. I'll walk. I wondered if Gus was thinking what I was, that it was liable to take him all night to get home with that up-down walk of his. But Gus just stretched and said, all righty then, and ambled off toward the house. See you, Howard said, and headed up the driveway toward the road. I sat there by the trap and looked over at Gus and Bertha's little house nestled on the side of the mountain. How come Bertha hadn't told me Mama had been there? Had Mama liked it here? Had she picked pole beans out of the garden with Gus? Had she helped Bertha make bread and butter pickles? Had she sat on the porch at night gazing up at Pegasus? Had she slept in that room with those canning jars? Finally, I got up and went inside. I looked around the living room at Gus's old easy chair, the dusty table coverings with magazines and coffee cups, the TV with a bowl of plastic fruit on top. Had Mama sat in that chair, propped her feet on that table while she watched soap operas on that TV? I could hear Gus and Bertha out on the porch talking. Every now and then, Bertha's laughter danced through the screen door. Finally, I went out there and sat in the lawn chair next to them. Light from the kitchen sent a soft glow over the porch. I took a deep breath and said, so Mama came here one time, right? The two of them looked at each other. Gus cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. Bertha reached over and put her hand on my arm. Yes, she did, she said. Oh, I watched one of the cats swatting a moth that was flitting around the porch. When? A long time ago, Bertha said. But when? When you were just a baby, she said. So I came too? From somewhere down in the woods, a bullfrog croaked, sending an echo across the mountains. Below us, crickets chirped in the tangled weeds under the porch. Bertha gave me a sad-eyed look. No, she said, you didn't come. What about Jackie? I said, did she come? No, Jackie didn't come either. But where were me and Jackie? I asked. And Scrappy, what about him? Bertha leaned over closer to me. She smelled like talcum powder. Charlie, she said, your mama came here and left you and Jackie and Scrappy behind. Showed up on my doorstep in the middle of the night with a garbage bag full of clothes. Did she come to visit? I asked, but in my heart I knew the answer to that question. No, Charlie, Bertha said. She just upped and left y'all without looking back. Bertha's voice suddenly had an edge to it, sharp and angry sounding. I would have never guessed Bertha could sound angry like that. Oh, I said. Bertha continued, her voice getting sharper and angrier. When I asked her what in the world she was doing running off like that, she looked me straight in the eye and said, I'm tired of my old life. I'm starting a new one. A flash of heat lightning lit up the sky over the mountains, and there was a low rumble of thunder. Then what happened, I asked. Bertha let out a big sigh. Her new life didn't last too long. How long? A couple of months. But what happened? I told her what I thought about her new life, and I reckon she didn't like it. She didn't want to hear what I thought about a mama who up and leaves her children behind. She stormed out of here like a freight train and hightailed it back to her old life, and I haven't seen her since. Another rumble of thunder echoed across the valley below us. I tried to call, but she wouldn't even talk to me, Bertha said. I sent you and Jackie cards and gifts, but she sent them right back. After a while, I gave up. She patted my knee. I'm sorry to tell you these things, Charlie. I shrugged like it was no big deal, but my quivering chin must have given me away. Bertha knelt in front of me and took both my hands in hers and said, Your mama loves you very much, Charlie, but sometimes she just loses her way. Loses her way? I'd be happy to draw her map to show her the way back to being my mama again. I stared out into the dark woods below us and sent my laser thoughts zipping through the trees and over the creek and down in the streets of town to wherever Wishbone was. I wanted him to know how much I needed him and what a great life he would have with me. And I didn't even care one bit if Mama had a hissy fit about him. I wonder if Wishbone will come get his food in the trap tonight, I said. He'd be a darn fool dog if he didn't, Gus said. And something tells me that dog is no fool, Butterbean. This time, when he called me Butterbean, instead of feeling like a baby, I felt a tiny smile tugging at the corners of my mouth, even though my insides were twisted up knowing my mama had just upped and left me like that. Then I said goodnight and went back to my room. I sat by the window and watched the heat lightning. Where was Wishbone? Chasing somebody's chickens? Fighting with that little black dog down by those trailers? Or maybe he was out there in the trap this very minute eating tuna noodle casserole. I climbed into bed and thought about Mama. What was her new life supposed to be? Was she going to stay here in Colby forever? Was she going to be a school teacher or a librarian? Or maybe open a beauty parlor down there on Black Mountain Road? Was she going to find a new husband who didn't fight so much? Was she going to have new kids and give them cake with pink and purple flowers when they got home from school? But what was the use of thinking about that? She had gone back to her old life, and there she is, and here I am, with my family all broken and scattered every which way. Outside the rain had started, slow and soft at first, and then faster and louder. The wind picked up and blew cool and damp through the screens. Suddenly I sat up, my heart pounding. I hadn't made my wish today. My mind raced, thinking about my list of things to wish on. Too late for stars, no ladybugs in here, no four-leaf clovers or pennies or dandelions. And then I couldn't believe what happened next. From far off in the trees outside the window came the song of a mockingbird. Hearing a bird sing in the rain is on my list of things to wish on, so I closed my eyes and made my wish. Chapter 13. And so my life in Colby, North Carolina marched on, rumbling down the mountain on the school bus beside Howard, ignoring those hillbilly kids who wouldn't give me the time of day, playing Bible detective at church, waiting for Wishbone to eat hot dogs from the pie tin, gazing up at the stars on the porch with Gus and Bertha, making my wish every day. Jackie called every once in a while to tell me about her happy life back in Raleigh. She was going to go to prom with the boy Arlo. She and Carol Lee might work at the Waffle House this summer. She got a fake tattoo of a butterfly on her ankle. I told her about Wishbone and how he was going to be mine, and she asked me if I really thought that was a good idea. I told her yes, it was a very good idea. I had seen Wishbone 3 more times, sniffing at trash in the parking lot at the Dairy Freeze, trotting along Highway 14 in the rain, eating something out of a paper bag under a picnic table beside Brushy Creek. Twice I'd found the pie tin in the trap empty, but I hadn't seen him anywhere nearby. Luckily, there were only 2 more weeks of school left, and then I would have my days free to spend more time by the trap. But I was beginning to worry that Wishbone was never going to be mine. Maybe I was wasting my time even thinking about it. I heard Wishbone barking last night, Howard said one day while we sat on the old couch in the front porch eating popsicles. How do you know it was him? I asked, watching Cotton jumping onto a milk crate in the yard with orange popsicle juice running down his chin and onto his bare stomach. I just know, Howard said. We're never going to catch him, I said. Gus was right. He likes being a stray. Don't be a quitter, Howard said. I'm not a quitter. Yes, you are. I stamped my foot. I am not. Howard licked melted popsicle off the side of his hand and said, pineapple. I flopped back against the sofa and hurled my popsicle stick out into the yard. That pineapple plant of his was starting to get on my nerves. Oh, good gravy, Charlie, he said. Don't be a baby. I'm not a baby, I hollered. Howard shrugged. "You sure are acting like one," he said. And just then, Mrs. Odom came out on the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. But my temper had a hold on me, and I could not shake it. I also could not stop myself from yelling, "Well, at least I'm not a squirrel-eating hillbilly like you." Then I stomped down the steps, marched across the yard, climbed on the back of Lenny's bike, and raced up the road toward Gus and Bertha's. When I got there, I dropped the bike in the yard and headed for the house, but as I reached the front door, I heard something over by the trap. I turned to look and couldn't believe my eyes. Wishbone was in there gobbling up meatloaf and french fries. I didn't waste one more second. I raced across the yard and slammed the door of the trap shut with a bang. Wishbone let out a yelp and jumped clear up off the ground. Then he slinked back into the corner and hung his head, dragging his ears on the ground. He looked so scared it nearly broke my heart. "Hey, Wishbone," I whispered. He pushed against that chicken wire so hard I was afraid he might bust right through it. "I got more meatloaf," I said. He cocked his head. "Wait right here," I said. "I'll be back." I closed the latch on the door of the trap and hurried inside the house, calling for Bertha. We nearly collided when I darted into the kitchen. She clutched her heart and said, "Charlie, Lordy, you scared the dickens out of me." "I got him," I hollered. "I got Wishbone." I yanked the refrigerator door open and took out a foil-wrapped slice of meatloaf and ran back out to the yard. Bertha ran after me, calling, "I knew it! I knew my meatloaf would do the trick." When we got to the trap, Wishbone was digging at the ground beside the wire like he was trying to dig a hole clear through to China. Dirt and pebbles flew out behind him. When he saw us, he stopped and backed up into the far corner of the trap again. I unwrapped the foil. "I brought you more meatloaf," I said. He let out a little whine, soft and pitiful. I could hear Bertha telling me to be careful and don't stick my fingers through the chicken wire and stuff like that. But I kept my eyes on Wishbone and told him not to be scared. Then I stuck a piece of meatloaf through the wire near him and waited. His nose twitched as the meatloaf smell drifted his way. He stood up and sniffed some more. "Come on, Wishbone," I said. "It's for you." He took one step forward, keeping his eyes on the meatloaf. He took another step and then another until he was right at my hand. Then he snatched that meatloaf, swallowed it in one gulp, and wagged his tail. Wag, wag, wag. 3 tiny wags like he was thanking me. I turned to Bertha. "Did you see that?" I said. Bertha nodded. "I sure did. I confess, I thought you were going to lose a finger or two." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out 2 saltine crackers. "Give him these," she said. I gave Wishbone the crackers, and after he gobbled them up, he looked at me and wagged his tail again. Then Bertha helped me look for the collar Gus had made from an old leather belt of his. We got rope from the garden shed and tied it to the collar. I ran back inside and got more food, some cereal, a piece of raisin bread, a couple slices of bologna. Then I raced back out to the trap with Bertha not far behind, calling, "Wait for me!" Chapter 14. Wishbone didn't like that collar one bit. He bucked like a bronco when I put it on him, flinging his head this way and that. Then he sat down and dug his feet in like a mule when I pulled on the rope to get him out of the trap. But after leaving a trail of bologna like Hansel and Gretel's breadcrumbs, I managed to get him to follow me step by step to the house. Once we were inside, Bertha locked the screen door and I untied the rope. Then we sat on the sofa and watched him. He sniffed everything that was worth sniffing in that house. The shaggy green rug by the front door, Gus's easy chair, Bertha's basket of yarn. Then he made his way cautiously through the rest of the house, inspecting the coat rack by the back door, licking crumbs off of the linoleum floor under the kitchen table. When he spied one of the cats up on the windowsill, he let out a bark. The cat arched his back and hissed. I was relieved when Wishbone just walked away. Bertha had been worried that he was going to chase the cats, and I have to admit, I had been worried a little bit too. After a while, he got tired of sniffing and laid down next to the sofa and went to sleep. I tiptoed over and sat beside him, stroking his fur and whispering his name. I couldn't hardly believe I had a dog of my very own. When Gus got home that night, he seemed pleased as punch to see Wishbone sitting there in the kitchen while Bertha cooked chicken fried steak and black-eyed peas. "Well, don't that beat all?" he said. I couldn't keep my hands off Wishbone. I petted his head and stroked his ears and scratched his belly. "Isn't he something?" I said. Gus nodded. "He sure is." "He smells like something, too," Bertha said, making a face. "You're going to have to give him a bath out in the yard tomorrow." "I will." Tomorrow was Saturday, so I had all the day to spend with him. I'd bathe him and walk him. Maybe I'd teach him a trick, like to sit or lay down. I might even take him to Howard's house if I decided not to be mad at him anymore for calling me a quitter and a baby. And then I remembered calling him a squirrel-eating hillbilly with Mrs. Odom standing right there on the porch. My stomach squeezed up and my face burned just thinking about that. I knew Howard wouldn't be mad because that was his way, but I bet Mrs. Odom hated me now. I bet she wouldn't want me in her house messing up their goodness with my hateful words. That night, I took Wishbone out on the porch with us. Every now and then, he perked his ears up at the sound of a rabbit or something rustling down in the woods, but eventually he laid down and rested his chin right on top of my foot. He didn't even pay any mind to the cat strolling around him. "I think you got yourself a good one, Charlie," Gus said. I smiled down at Wishbone. "I bet he'll be as good as Skeeter," I said. Gus nodded. "I bet he will." "You know what I like best about dogs?" Bertha said. Gus and I waited. "They love you no matter what." Bertha smiled down at Wishbone. "Shoot, I know folks who are cranky or stuck up or bold-faced liars, and their dogs love them like they're saints or something. Know what I mean?" Gus nodded and said, "Yep." "I hate to admit it," Bertha went on, "but I bet half of these cats of mine would run off and never look back if somebody came along with a can of sardines." I leaned down and ran my hand down Wishbone's side. His fur was soft and warm, and he snored real soft while he slept. Then I gazed up at the starry sky and had a feeling I hadn't had in a long time. Thankful. I felt thankful that I had my very own dog who would love me no matter what. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was look for Wishbone to make sure I hadn't just dreamed he was mine. Sure enough, there he was, curled up on the floor beside me. I put one of my pillows there for him, and he hadn't wasted 1 minute flopping down on it. I spent the morning bathing him and combing him and picking burrs out of his tail and ticks off his ears. I knew he didn't like it much, but he let me do it. When I was done, he looked so handsome and smelled so good that Bertha kept making a fuss over him and running back into the house to get him another chicken liver. He was so skinny you could count his ribs right through his fur. "We need to fatten him up," Bertha said. After lunch, I practiced walking him with the rope tied to his collar. At first, he made it clear that he didn't like it. He jerked his head this way and that or sit down and refused to budge. But I kept a plastic bag full of tiny pieces of cheese and bacon and stuff to lure him along, and after a while he was trotting right beside me. Around the yard, through the garden, up the driveway and back. I let him take a nap tied up in the shade of the big oak tree on the steep slope by the back porch. Bertha brought a tablecloth outside and spread it on the ground next to him. Then the two of us had pimento cheese sandwiches and sweet tea for lunch. Bertha told me a story about some old man named Cooter who used to be the mayor of Colby. He carried a gun, she said, and if anybody parked in front of town hall where they weren't supposed to, he'd shoot their tires out. Really? Really. And his wife used to wash her underpants and hang them on the antenna of her car and drive around town till they were dry. I wrinkled my nose and said, "Ew." Bertha laughed. "I know. That big old underwear looked like the national flag of the land of big behinds flapping in the breeze like that." Me and Bertha had a good laugh over that. Every now and then, Wishbone's feet jerked and he let out a little yelp while he slept. I wondered if he was dreaming about running free again, without a rope tied to him. I hoped not. I took a gulp of sweet tea and watched the honeybees flitting over the clover beside us. Clover. Maybe I could find a 4-leaf clover. So while Bertha told me about how Cooter and his wife bought a gold mine in Nevada and moved away, I searched and searched. Sure enough, I found one, but I didn't pick it. If you pick it, it will bring you good luck, but if you leave it growing there, you can make a wish, which is exactly what I did. After lunch, I decided I wasn't mad at Howard anymore, so I tied Wishbone's rope leash to the handlebars of Lenny's bike and pedaled down the road to the Odoms. Wishbone seemed to love that, racing along beside me with his ears flapping and his tongue hanging out. When I got to Howard's, he and Dwight and Cotton were in the front yard playing some game that involved throwing tin cans and punching each other. "Hey, y'all," I called. "Look what I got." They raced over and gathered around Wishbone, stroking his back and patting his head. "Wow, Charlie," Howard said, "you did it." I couldn't stop myself from beaming at him. "I know," I said, "and isn't it great?" Howard scratched behind Wishbone's ears. "Looks like he's got some beagle in him," he said. "I like his ears." While the Odom boys made a fuss over him, Wishbone sat there with his eyes closed and a doggy smile on his face. We played with him the whole afternoon. Cotton kept tossing popcorn for him to catch, and Dwight led him up across the yard on the leash and got him to jump up onto the old cooler and sit. Howard even taught him to shake hands in no time flat. "He's smart," Howard said, and we all nodded in agreement. "Let's show Mama his tricks," Howard said, hurrying to the porch in his up-down way. With everybody making a fuss over Wishbone, I'd forgotten about what I had said yesterday when Scrappy's temper had gotten a hold of me. but when Mrs. Odom came out to the yard to see Wishbone, I remembered. My face burned and I couldn't even look at her. Howard showed her how Wishbone could sit on the cooler and shake hands. "Ain't he smart?" he said. "He is smart for sure," Mrs. Odom said, "and lucky he's found such a friend as Charlie." I felt relief wash over me. Maybe Mrs. Odom wasn't mad at me after all. "Let's get some treats and teach him to roll over," Howard said. "That's a good idea," Mrs. Odom ruffled my hair. "I've got some squirrel pie fresh out of the oven." I wanted to sink right into the ground when she said that, or disappear into thin air. Poof! Gone! But of course I couldn't. So I just stood there with my face burning and my stomach in a knot. Dwight and Cotton hooted and hollered, slapping their knees and saying, "Squirrel pie?" Mrs. Odom put her arm around my shoulder, and when I got up the courage to look at her, she winked at me. "I'm so glad to have a feisty female around here to help me keep these boys under control. I've been needing a girl on my team." On her team? Mrs. Odom needed me on her team? I wish I could have saved that moment there in that wheat-filled yard, surrounded by those good-hearted Odoms, with Wishbone sitting there on the cooler in front of us. Just pack it in one of Bertha's canning jars and keep it in my room. Then, when I was feeling bad about myself or loaded down with all my troubles, I could open it up and breathe in the goodness of it, and I'd feel better. But the moment passed, and Howard brought a piece of chicken out to the yard, and we tried to teach Wishbone to roll over, but all he wanted to do was eat that chicken. "Back in Raleigh, we've got a fence around our yard, so he can run free back there," I said. Howard's smile faded, and he said, "Do you think your mama will let you keep him?" Shoot! I wished he hadn't said that, because it stirred up my worries, and I've been doing such a good job of keeping them locked up tight. The truth of the matter was, there was no telling what Mama would think about me showing up with Wishbone. But I managed to push that worry away and say, "Sure, she will. She's gonna love him." "When are you leaving?" Howard asked in a tiny, quivery voice. I shrugged. "I don't know," I said. "Soon, I bet." But I knew in my heart that Mama still didn't have her feet on the ground. I mean, I hadn't even gotten so much as a postcard or a phone call from her since I'd left Colby. I knew she was still laying around in her bathrobe in the dark, drinking diet soda for supper and not thinking about me one bit. Howard got quiet after that, so I finally tied Wishbone to the bike and headed back up to Gus and Bertha's. When I got there, Gus was sitting at the kitchen table while Bertha sliced green peppers from the garden and jabbered about the fancy new drugstore they were building out on Route 26. "Well, there they are," Gus said when he saw me and Wishbone. "A girl and her dog." Then he reached in his pocket and pulled out something that he held out to me in his palm, a little bone-shaped dog tag with Wishbone engraved on it. He turned it over and showed me it had a phone number on the other side. "Gus," Bertha squealed, "you are a prince." She kissed his cheek. "Ain't he a prince, Charlie?" I nodded. "Then I may be a king when you take a look at that," Gus said, nodding toward the coat rack by the back door. Hanging there on the raincoats and cardigans was a red dog leash. "I figured he needed a real leash instead of that old rope," Gus said. Bertha kissed him again. "Now you are a king," she said. "Ain't he, Charlie?" I just couldn't get over Gus going and doing such a nice thing for me. "Yes, ma'am," I agreed. "He is." Then Gus took Wishbone's collar off, attached the little tag to it, and put it back on. When I looked down at him with his collar on and his very own tag with his very own name, he seemed like he'd be mine forever, like he belonged right here with me, not a stray anymore. And in the middle of that happy moment, I had a tiny seed of a thought that I hurried to push out of my mind before it had time to grow. The thought was this: where in the world do I belong?